restrictive, repetitive and rigid behaviours. But what I would first like to say is that that classification and those words around those behaviours are really negative, and actually sometimes place a stigma upon behaviours that an autistic individual actually uses to help cope and manage their day-to-day life. And actually they don't feel restrictive to that young person or adult. They don't feel repetitive and they don't feel rigid. And in fact, those behaviours that they display that may look rigid and repetitive to other people are coping strategies sometimes that can help them get through their day-to-day life. Because as we go through these videos and as you learn more about autism, I think you can actually sit there and reflect on how difficult it might be for someone to live a life when they are autistic, because there are so many demands, there are so many sensory stimulations in this world. It can be quite a challenge. And I think what an amazing job these young people and adults do on a daily basis to turn up to school, to engage, you know, to be fantastic young people and grow and develop to be the best version of them they can. So when we do talk about these behaviours, we are aware that we want to start using positive language. We want to start using words like coping strategies, words like stimulation and sensory experiences and things that they really get a lot out of and actually help them and that are really positive. And I know, Lois, you spoke to one of our colleagues about their autism and how their behaviours really help them, and I thought it would be great for us to share some information about that with everyone.
Yeah, it was really good to speak to him about it, actually, and he was really open and honest. And I have got some notes, so please do excuse me while I keep referring back to them. But when I spoke to him the other day, I asked him if he could explain to me how restricted, repetitive, rigid behaviours impacted his life, and he explained to me, as you said, April, that these behaviours, yes, they're rigid and yes, they can be repetitive, but not necessarily restrictive. So he explained that he gets a thought in his head, and sometimes that thought is perhaps a work-related issue. So there could be, for an example, he works here at Daisy Chain, an issue, and he's got that thought in his head, and he knows that if he does this repetitive behaviour, and you and I both know that one of those behaviours is he'll walk around from his desk, then he will walk backwards to his desk, he'll do a 360-degree spin, and then go back to where he was sitting behind his desk. And he'll repeatedly do that, and that's his repetitive behaviour. And he was explaining the reason that he does that is so that this problem that he's got in his head can actually be resolved. So that repetitive behaviour is the solution to the problem. So if we stop him from doing that, we're stopping him from finding the solution to the issue that he's got, that he's carrying in inside his brain, is how he describes it. And he says that he gets really anxious. So, for example, if perhaps I go down to the desk and I need to speak to him about something, and he's got this problem in his brain, I've interrupted him from finding the solution to the problem, and then that makes him quite anxious. So that adds to the problem. So I've inadvertently made the problem worse because I've stopped him finding the solution. He'll become really anxious and agitated about that, and then that's all he can focus on. So he can't give me a solution to my problem that I've gone to ask him for help with, because he's now agitated and anxious because he's not finding the solution. So we can see how this builds up, can't we, really? He says that it really helps him, that if he's at work, he has to have a degree of control about it. And to an extent, he can control it, but then that has a negative impact on him when he gets home. And he said it's all he can think about. So is that he's got to get that task done. I've been asked to do that task, so I have to complete it. And once I've done that task, then I can do my repetitive behaviour to help me to find a solution to the problem. So he always needs to complete that repetitive behaviour. And he really did put it into really good context. And he explained again that he does it because there's a problem in my head that makes me feel unsettled, and that gives him the resolution to the problem. So it was really good to get his perspective on that. He says that he needs to perform the rituals because it gives him some control back. They help me to get my thoughts in order. And he explained as well that he's had CBT, cognitive behaviour therapy, for this before. And he said they've explained to him, and he understands it, that he's made an association in his brain that when he does this behaviour, his anxiety reduces. So when he's got the issue, his anxiety level travels and it gets higher and higher. When he does the repetitive behaviour, the anxiety level comes down. But what the cognitive behaviour therapy has explained to him is that eventually his anxiety levels would have always come back down anyway without the repetitive behaviour. But he's made the association that the repetitive behaviour reduces his anxiety. So it's a comfort, it's a security for him, it helps him to feel better. It's a solution to the problem, and it's a positive thing. But he said with that is a negative as well. And he said that over time, and he knows this now looking back, but over time, the need to do it increased and increased and increased, so that the repetitive behaviours become more and more and more. He was then becoming unable to control them at work, and that's why he sought some advice and had the cognitive behaviour therapy, because he was struggling to control it, because it had grown slowly and progressively over time without him realising, and that then had impacted into his life. So at the time he thought it was a solution and a comfort, but it took over his life and he needed help with that. So he said a lot of people think the behaviour thought is the problem, but it's not. So I think what we need to understand is we're seeing that behaviour, but what is the issue underlying that behaviour needs to happen? That's what we need to try and understand for our young people, and I think that's really key. So it was really great to get for him to share that with me, and I feel like it really made me understand more those rigid, repetitive, restrictive behaviours. But I feel really uncomfortable now, having had that conversation, using the word restrictive. As you were saying, April, it's not necessarily restrictive. And I think as well, you'll remember when we went to the National Autistic Society Professionals Conference, we heard Pete Warmby speak, and he explained how this can impact even getting out of the door and into school. So we find this quite a lot with our families, don't we? Parents will ring up asking for support because they can't get their young person actually up, ready and out the door for school. And Pete Warmby talked about a young person that he'd supported who was a Minecrafter. And when she woke up on a morning, that was all she could focus on, was Minecraft and what she needed to do and what the next steps were in her Minecrafting, and when was she going to get the time to do that. And that built her anxiety, and it was all she could think about. And she needed to get on the computer and Minecraft, so she would skip breakfast. So then people talk about being hangry. So that's hungry, having effect on mood and making them angry, and it is a real thing. She would then be off to a bad start. She'd skip breakfast because she had to do that routine of Minecraft. It was all she could think about. Then when her parents are telling her to get washed and dressed, that is taking her away from that repetitive behaviour, that activity that she has to do. It's all she can think about. So then there's a difficulty in the getting dressed. She then struggles to know which order to put her uniform on in and what she needs to do next, which is where a visual timetable at home can be really useful as well as in school. And then parents have started getting cross with her because they're going to be late. So you can see how that builds and builds and builds, and how when our colleague talked about it taking over your life, you can see how it can take over life as well and create those difficulties that sometimes overspilling we see in school.
Yeah, and I know that we often use the word stimming to refer to self-stimulatory behaviour in terms of repetitive behaviour, movements or kind of sounds that can really help a person. And when you think about it, it's not only autistic people that stim. So who taps their pen on the table when they're anxious? Who moves their leg from side to side if they're feeling a bit nervous? Who kind of might, do something which is a repetitive behaviour when they feel anxious or nervous or upset or any kind of big feeling to help them cope with that feeling. It just so happens that a lot of autistic people have a lot of big, intense feelings. If their feeling dial was immovable, it would be on full the whole time. They can often feel sadness extremely intensely, happiness extremely intensely. So they can carry out these stimming behaviours, and that can really help them cope. But it can also be an expression of emotion and feeling. So quite often you'll get someone who will do a happy stim, and it's absolutely amazing as a professional to work with someone when you're working with them and then they happy stim. You feel like you've won the lottery when when they start flapping their hands and they start really going for it, and you're like, you know what, I've really connected with this young person, and they're really engaged. And stimming can be anything from kind of moving your fingers to kind of rocking up and down on your feet, to rocking back and forth, to clearing your throat, to blinking, tilting your head to the side and coughing. It can be any repetitive behaviour that makes a young person feel a certain way and helps them cope with a situation or emotion. And quite often, as these young people develop into adulthood, and when they're looking at transition into adulthood, maybe from the age of 13, 14, some of these stimming behaviours can have negative connotations and negative thoughts attached to them. So you might see a 15-year-old coming in from school and stripping off naked when he gets in the door, because he is so kind of overwhelmed with the day, and then maybe he starts jumping all around and he's got nothing on, and it's inappropriate because he's got a younger sister or a younger brother, or just inappropriate the fact that he's getting older now and he needs to kind of understand what's private. But what needs to be understood is actually that behaviour is him stimming by jumping and moving around loads to try and cope with the situation, and kind of taking his clothes off due to being so overloaded with the day. So actually, instead of immediately trying to stop that behaviour, it's about trying to understand it so that you can put support around it. Because I think sometimes we have parent callers and we have young people in our social clubs that would tell us, I just keep getting told to stop it. I keep clearing my throat in classroom, and Miss says it's disruptive, and they keep telling me to stop it, but I can't stop it. And if I try to hold it in, I feel like I'm going to explode. I feel like there's a beast inside of me, and I'm trying to hold it in, and I'm trying to keep it chained up. And the more I keep it chained up, it just gets angrier and angrier and angrier, and then it finally explodes. And then the stimming behaviour comes out even more so than it was going to ever come out, and it becomes more intense than it was going to before. And I think sometimes that, like you say, that behaviour that can look repetitive can be a massive coping strategy, and people can get quite concerned with the behaviour, and rightly so, because sometimes if the behaviour puts a child at risk, or is not a safe behaviour, then I understand why that behaviour needs to be changed. But sometimes it's about understanding what is going on. That young person doesn't want to potentially turn on the light every time they come in the room to stress the whole classroom out, but actually it's a need that they have, and putting a switch, a plain switch with no electrical kind of circuit in it on their desk, and doing that switching behaviour, or a fidget cube, might actually help them in that classroom. Or looking at another way that they can get that sensory stimulation, and they can get that feedback, and they can get that coping strategy, but for a safe way and for a safe behaviour. And I know the rigidity that can sometimes affect a person on the spectrum, it can even feel restrictive for them. So they can get quite frustrated with the fact that they can't deal with last minute changes, because for our young people on the spectrum, their behaviours often lies with anxiety. And the only way to then support those behaviours is then to support the anxiety and to find out what's really going on underneath. So on the surface, you might see a young person who is quite bouncy, bouncing around everywhere, spinning, kind of maybe flapping a little bit, or maybe doing the sensory stimulation, which can't really be viewed, it can't be seen. Maybe they're doing it under their jumper or under their jacket, or they're biting something, or kind of that type of behaviour, and it's a bit less obvious. But actually, maybe they're struggling with the homework. Maybe they're struggling with the communication in the classroom. Maybe they don't understand what they need to do. Maybe they've been given too many tasks and it's too hard and they don't know how to ask for help. So all of their behaviour are based with anxiety. And like Lois said, we'll go into behaviour and communication at a later video, because we believe here that all behaviour is communication, and we've just got to be a detective and work out what is going on underneath that behaviour. And I do think with their rigid thinking, they can get involved in routines, can't they, Lois?
Yeah, routine's really important, isn't it, for our young people?
Yeah, and you can create routine, can't you, to make an autistic person feel safer and less anxious?
Definitely, yeah, definitely.
So we created routine around anything really, so getting up and going to school, getting dressed, going in the shower, doing an activity at school, engaging in PE, doing homework, how to revise when you're coming up to an exam, what the transition may look like from one classroom to the next, or from one school to the next if they're moving up years or moving schools. Kind of routines and visuals can be created for all of these, and actually sometimes you can tap in to their need for a routine, and you can actually get a desired outcome by trying to help them build a routine. And in you building that routine and maybe providing a visual and some structure, then slowly stepping back, they can take that routine off for themselves and they can implement it independently. And that's quite often how we look at putting into place independent skills as they're getting older and they're looking at transitioning into adulthood. So I think I do agree with the man that you spoke with at Daisy Chain around that word restrictive. Yes, they can be restrictive and they can actually frustrate some autistic people, but actually a lot of the time they are really, really beneficial and they really help them cope. And an autistic adult once said to me that routine is really helpful when you're anxious, and it really helps and it makes you feel safe. But actually when you're not anxious, routine can and certain processes can make you feel claustrophobic and can make you feel trapped. So it's about listening to that young person, where they're at in that moment, how they're feeling on that day. Do they need a routine? Do they not? And just kind of letting them lead their learning, letting them lead the processes, and letting them lead their development, because they will get there. It just needs to be in line with their needs.
Yeah, I think it's really hard for schools, but I think it's really important, like you said, April, that we let them lead what their need is and teach us what their need is, and we work with that. I had a little boy in year 1, so he was only 5, and he repetitively formed his letter F in his writing. So if he was doing a piece of writing and a word had the letter F in it, he would repetitively form that letter with his pencil, rub it out and do it again, rub it out and do it again, rub it out and do it again. So in a 10-minute writing task, we may have got 2 sentences, or not even 2 sentences. The minute we've got to the F, we've stopped, because he has to do that repetitive behaviour. And I remember the teacher saying to me, we need to sort this. We can't allow this to happen. You know, you need to get him to carry on writing the sentence. And it's a case of, we've got 2 choices. We stop him doing that repetitive behaviour that he needs to do, in which case we could cause a potential problem, because we don't know how that young person is going to react when we stop them from doing that repetitive behaviour. He could end up lashing out, he could hurt himself, he could hurt other children, he could hurt the teacher. Or we allow him to do the repetitive behaviour for as long as he needs to, and just hope that eventually he will become calmer and he won't have that anxiety, and it will reduce, and he'll be happier, and he'll not have the need to do that anymore. And in actual fact, we went for the second option because nobody wanted a child in distress, a child who might end up hurting himself or hurting others. And we allowed him to do his repetitive behaviour. And because we allowed him to do it, within a couple of weeks, he then moved on to another repetitive behaviour and was able to do his writing. And therefore then, yes, the teacher was having to do his writing assessment a little bit later than the other children's, but she got the writing assessment completed eventually without causing upset to anybody in that learning environment. So having heard what our colleagues said, I'd sometimes questioned whether I'd given the right advice there to the teacher in that situation. But having spoken to our colleague, yes, I did give the right advice. It's really important that we allow that behaviour, that we don't try and stop it. And I know you talked about whether it was appropriate or not, or whether it was going to hurt somebody else. And sometimes we would need to try and divert that behaviour, but not take it away, but give a replacement almost, and try and offer an alternative so that we're not taking it away, because it's really important for our young people.
Yeah, and I can give an example of that. So I worked with a young girl who really liked people crying. She had got a lot of stimulation, sensory, in her auditory stimulation from people screaming and crying. So she would go around and hit people. So it looked as if she was kind of not being very nice. She was bullied. She got called a bully. Her parents were absolutely distraught and were ringing us for some support and advice. And the school had said to me, she just loves people crying. So she goes and hits them. And when we actually did an iceberg, which we can attach to this folder and to this below this video, and we looked at what was happening, she was enjoying the touch, the physical pressure of hitting someone. So actually, if you could see her running and looking for someone, getting there with a high five, quickly getting there with a high five, and then once she started giving that high five and that deep pressure, she stopped hitting the other children. And then actually what they did is they put like a handprint on the wall, and they named it her hand. And every time she wanted to, she could go and high five that wall and that hand. So then you even then took the support away. So she went from hurting other children to doing an appropriate behaviour with support to then doing it independently and self-soothing that behaviour. And I think sometimes you just need to find out what's underlying and what's going on. And I know that some of our colleagues and some parents can really struggle with the thought of the behaviour becoming sexualised maybe when they get a little bit older. And some advice I might give to that is try to think about your child's developmental age, because physically your child may be 14, but emotionally and mentally and socially they may not be their chronological age. They may be functioning at a much lower age. So in terms of your expectations, what would you expect from maybe a 10-year-old if your child is functioning a little bit lower in their learning and development? And try to treat them with their kind of emotional age and their social age rather than their chronological age. And just because we as adults put sexualised thoughts and feelings onto a behaviour, don't automatically assume that that's what the young person gets from that behaviour. We had a young person who used to rock and like rub their bum on the carpet, and even when they went into secondary school, they would like to try to rub their bum on things, and staff were really, really concerned about that behaviour being sexualised, and that they were seeking women, or that they were seeking kind of peers to do this behaviour and kind of rub their bum. But it turned out, after all of the kind of complex decisions and discussions that were happening, he didn't like the feeling of his boxers in his underwear. And all the way through primary, secondary, Mum had just thought that they were okay, and he'd never said otherwise, but they really, really irritated him. And actually that rubbing, that sensation really helped him cope with that and kind of regulate, but he never just put two and two together. But through discussing it and kind of trying different options, it was then he just put some different pants on, and then that behaviour over time stopped, because he struggled to immediately stop it, because it then became a little bit of a routine for him. But then, you know, comic strip stories was used, and social stories were used to have that kind of conversation around what other people may view that behaviour as. And once he understood it and then found other ways to kind of express himself, it worked really well at kind of lowering that behaviour a little bit. So I know that some of the behaviours can be a little bit concerning, they could be worrying, you can worry about others in the classroom, or kind of them being vulnerable to peers, but just try to understand what's going on, and if you do need any support with understanding or implementing some strategies or looking at starting to change behaviour, but remember, it doesn't always need to be changed, and just because we feel it's not appropriate doesn't mean it's not appropriate for the young person. Please do get in touch with the family support team, and we can look at supporting you through that and giving you any advice around that. And again, everyone's autism is very unique, and everyone displays different behaviours, different stimming, and maybe not all behaviours that young people use for stimming are out there and will be visual. Like the young person like some of the young people that we know, they often can hold in their stimming until they get home, and they can mask it, and then it can be really bad at home, and they can have loads of rituals and routines at home that aren't seen outside of the classroom, outside of the house. So again, just listen to parents, listen to the young people, because at all times at Daisy Chain we try to get the voices of young people and those on the spectrum and adults, because they are the ones that can tell their story. They are the ones that can help us understand them, and there's no greater resource than an autistic person telling you how they're feeling and helping us learn more about their autism.